In 2006, a group of 3 teenagers went for a ride in Wisconsin in the evening in Chevrolet Cobalt, model 2005. And all of a sudden, when they made a turn, their car veered off the road. And the driver lost complete control. The airbags did not deplete. After flying a bit, the car landed in a telephone utility box and into some trees. And unfortunately, 2 passengers died, and the driver was severely injured. And why did that happen? Right? You can say the driver was maybe a bit intoxicated or whatever. No, they were all perfectly sane and okay before they started. However, what had happened is that the key had turned into auxiliary or off position, so the driver had no control over the car. He lost complete control of it, and the airbags did not deplete, again, because of an ignition switch. So basically in the ignition switch, there's this thing called a plunger, which is like a small spring, which controls how difficult it is to turn your key into the different positions. And this one is just a bit too short, which makes it very easy, especially when you move very quickly and if you have some heavy key things on your keychain. Basically, it's very simple to turn around. Now, it turns out that General Motors, who produced this car, according to different sources of information, they have known about this issue since 2001. And the question is, why didn't they fix it, right? Like, what happened there? We're talking about, if you check results, we're talking about models produced all the way back to 1997, all the way up to 2013-14, having the same faulty ignition switch. Okay? So then we ask the question, who's the culprit? How is that possible? How has that happened? Who would you say the culprit is? What would you guess? Anyone? It's a evil manager, right? It's an evil manager who said, well, General Motors have been known for quite a while, have been known for quite a while to cut costs. So you say, well, actually changing this part costs around 57 cents, but when you think about all the cars that we have to recall, it's still going to be cheaper to just settle things, some cases in court, right? Then there's the other thing that around 2005 and 6, they actually, through their distributors, tried to inform some of their customers that maybe you should remove all the things from the keychain, which again shows that they knew about the problem. And they say, no, it wasn't a manager, it was probably some evil engineer who said, whoops, I made a mistake, so what can I do about that? Let's just keep it quiet. We don't want people to know we're bad, right? Or how about the fact that actually the plunger was changed to a new part, which was just significantly longer plunger, but it was still shorter than the specifications required for a more stiff switch between the states. And we wonder who's to blame in this. And as per their own admission, there was a report, a very thorough investigation, independently run for the company and what has happened. Over 41 million documents were checked out, more than 350, I think, interviews. And by their own admission, the culprit in this story is culture. By their own admission, it was a culture of silos. It was a culture in which you don't stand up. You don't say, hey, I'm taking responsibility, something was wrong here. Because if you do speak up, you might risk your job. And the message here is how powerful culture this is. Just to give you some nice part of the story, early this year, this story exploded. And actually, General Motors are working on recalling cars and exchanging the switch with the right part. However, why did it take such a long time to get there, right? Because There probably was no evil manager. There probably was no evil engineer. Imagine someone thinking, hey, I'm going to kill some people. That's not what we think, right? It's inconceivable. It's impossible. But when you are in a space where this is how we do things, and you're not supposed to do this, or you're supposed to do that, you become a part of it, and you become a kind of natural enforcer of the unwritten rules. And you can just, sorry, hold on. You can just take a look at the history in the last 100 years, for example, things that we are okay with, just because they're too far away, for example, right? So very often we just become conduits for these rules. We just happen to follow them. Culture is very powerful, and very often, even if you have very good rational intentions, you say, this is a very good thing to do, this is how we are supposed to do it, you have all the proofs and explanations as to why. If you fail to see the culture and all these unwritten rules that we follow, you are very likely to fail. Has any one of you here tried to, I don't know, implement TDD, Scrum, anything in your company, and failed? Lots of hands. We'll get back to that example. But the point is, we need to figure out how to work with our culture. The thing about doing rational things into our companies and figuring out how culture is more powerful than us is put in much better words by Peter Drucker, also earlier today quoted by Bjarte in his keynote, where he says, culture eats strategy for breakfast, a much simpler, cleaner way to put it. So whatever kind of strategy we try to implement, culture is going to eat it, if we do not take it in consideration. Another quote I really like, it's from the former professor at MIT, Edgar Schein, whom we're going to mention later today again. He says, the bottom line for leaders is that if they do not become conscious of the cultures in which they are embedded, those cultures will manage them. So we try, we do something, but if we're not aware of the underlying assumptions of the things that actually happen in our company and how we do things, we're very prone to fail. And I guess you will all agree with me that we are all in. We are all in this story. We're all a part of our culture. We all build it. Okay? 2 days ago, I noticed this tweet by Jeff Watts. He's the author of a Scrum Master book. I haven't read it, but I've heard good things about it. And he had written, I've never had anyone say to me, Scrum would work so much better if I changed how I. It's always, if someone else changed how they. Right? We always put it to the other ones. But we're also a part of it. We also need to do something about it. And what is culture? Edgar Schein has this beautiful definition. We say, okay, we're going to work with our culture, but what is culture? A pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration, which has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore be taught to new members as correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. That was a mouthful, sorry. Does anyone have a suggestion? How do you describe culture? One sentence. What is culture in your company? What is culture for you? It's what we do? Okay. Habit? Okay. So it's the way we do things around here, right? That's a very common way of explaining. So what's the culture? Well, this is how we do things. It's like we don't explicitly describe every single thing of our habits and patterns, but this is how we do it. Okay? Another very common definition that I like very much, it is what we do when we think no one is looking. Okay, so we have our own personal values and beliefs, and you have the company's values and beliefs. And then the question is, what do you actually do, right? It's how we all do things, but what do you do when you're in your room, cubicle, or even open space? What is it, how is it that you actually do things? And in order to demystify this thing culture, okay, this is a very, it's an empirical concept in a way, and it's a very blurry thing. We struggle to define it. So I'm going to share with you one model. Probably some of you are familiar with it. It's Edgar Schein's model. I use an iceberg to describe it. Apparently, iceberg is one of the most used pictures for a model. In fact, I found online that you can have a template PowerPoint slide on which you can kind of break the iceberg into pieces. But it works. It works. The reason why it works and the reason why it's a great metaphor is because we always talk about, you know what, only a piece of the iceberg is visible. And it's only that piece that we see. We sometimes talk about what is it that sinks the ship? Well, you know what, it's all the ice underneath. Right? The top is what we see, but it's huge underneath. And this is why I'm using this metaphor here as well. So basically he says, in this model, he splits culture into 3 pieces. One, nothing is happening. One we call artifacts, and that is the visible part. So what do you see when you come into a company? When you walk into a new company, what do you see? You see how people speak to each other, you see all the documents that describe their work. You have also all the obvious behaviors, like while I live in Norway, I currently work with a company in Madrid. And a team I recently worked with called Puckman, a very cool team, the first thing I noticed when I started working with them is that they laugh every single time we have any ceremony, any meeting, there's laughter. You know, I honestly laugh every single time we have a daily or whatever, and it's amazing. But the thing is that you can observe that laughter and at first point say, okay, I see laughter. But laughter could sometimes be perceived as sarcasm, right? We have a lot of companies in which you have all these Dilbert images, and we focus on the negative part of it. Or it could actually be something else, and that is trust among the team members, that everybody is doing the best they can, and this laughter is just our way to relax, because otherwise we're working really hard. And this is where we go to the next level, which is a bit less visible, which is espouse beliefs and values. So this is much more difficult to see, and it's sometimes confusing. It's a bit more abstract, and it usually is what people tell about their companies, okay? So if I ask you and you try to come in with some adjectives or some definitions of how you work, these are what you would tell me. This is what you believe. This is what you aspire to have in your company. And sometimes they could be a bit contradictory. So sometimes you could have something like, we equally care about our stakeholders, customers, and developers, right? Which sounds a bit contradictory. Because you're kind of in the land of what is and what ought to be, kind of. So it might be a bit confusing. But then, if you have the trust that we all work hard and play hard, the example with laughter, then you go to a much deeper level, which most of the time is completely invisible. And that is basic underlying assumptions. The basic underlying assumptions are the level where we have beliefs and values which we just take for granted. Okay? We take them for granted so much that we're not conscious that we do these things. We're not aware that this is how we do things around here. An example could be, recently a coach shared with me a story in which he went into this company and he was working on some topic and he went to a person in the company and said, hey, let's talk about something. And then this guy says, we got to put an appointment in Outlook, right? Because this is how things are done. But this is so natural. And then there's a bit of agitation. But how come? I mean, I'm here. We can just talk together, right? And these are the things that just happen. They're written nowhere, but these are your basic expectations, bless you, of how things are done around here. Okay? So these are those things that we absolutely take for granted. And they're very difficult to describe because you're not even aware that they are part of your environment. You just do them. You just go along with them. right? And only when you hear someone else's story, only when you compare it to someone else, you can say, ooh, that's a bit different from how we do things, okay? So, in the beginning, I kind of mentioned working with your culture and what happens when you try to introduce new things. My major motivation for doing this talk, apart from starting this new track on culture and my passion for it, is also because a few years ago, I wish somebody had shared or talked to me about this, because I also struggled with trying to introduce something which I apparently didn't know how to introduce properly. And the proper part isn't necessarily what's the right or wrong way, it's the way where you try to work with your culture, okay? And what do I mean by that? So, if your values, beliefs, espouse values and beliefs, and even more basic assumptions in the company are focused on cost-cutting, are focused on business, and this is the general mindset of communication, and you go to your manager and you try to explain, let's do TDD, let's do XP practices, pair programming, and then you say, because technical excellence, because it's one of the principles in the Agile manifesto, and we're going to be great developers, and the code is going to be great, and our QA is going to have less work. Maybe that's where you should continue. If the mindset is on business, on money, speak that language. Now, I'm not talking do politics. I'm not talking about how you should try to manipulate the system. But if you try to fight the system, if you try to go against the current, it is going to be difficult. You're going to get tired. And even if you do succeed, there's a bit of a question whether it's going to stick, whether it's going to be accepted by the culture. Because a change in a culture is a very slow and difficult process. Because only when it goes all through the levels down to a basic assumption, well, people forget who had this idea to begin with, or it's just something we do around here naturally, that is what you want to achieve. You want to achieve, this is our thing, and it just happens. We don't even think about it, right? So, as we talked about the basic level of basic assumptions, the hidden one, a lot of parts of our culture are very often hidden for us. So, if you think of a place where you consider a type of organization that's a bit more conservative, anyone, give me an example, something that's a bit more stiff, rigid. A bank, let's say the common bank. So if you go there and you ask people, what's your culture? Are you conservative? Do you think anyone would say, yes, we are conservative? No, right? Because it's hidden. And a lot of times, especially when we think about the beliefs and value level, we actually want to say good things about our culture. We want to be proud of what we belong to, right? So some of the things might be hidden for ourselves, from ourselves, okay? So, your culture in the mirror, the message being, we're not going to focus on how you change your culture today. The focus is on how you can show your culture, okay? How you can make your culture visible. And while it does feel like a sequential step of, okay, first I gotta show it, then I can change it, I do believe that you need to understand your culture, you need to show it at least to yourself, in order to work with it, in order to change it, okay? So if you do this in the process of changing, that'll be great and much more efficient. But what are the ways to show our culture? How do we visualize it? How do we show it? So I want to share with you tools and methods, one or two that I've used and worked well for me, and others which I could aspire to try out. And maybe you could share a few afterwards. So one of the things I've done is using the SHINE model, you do a workshop. So probably when I described the SHINE model to you, it sounded a bit academic. It sounded a bit, okay, let's split this into slices of cheese, and this is how things are, and we're going to put these labels and all these attributes and descriptions to it. But And it seems very difficult, so it's so hidden how we want to talk about it, especially the deepest level we want to get to. But if you start in a workshop or in a session, when you start from tangible things, you start from, let's say you have Scrum in your company, and you start from, okay, what are the Scrum values for us? What are the Scrum principles? And you start from basic thing that's common language. The track, this track in this conference focusing on team. In your team, you start going through things that we already talk about, tangible words and expressions. And then you go down to, okay, what are our Scrum values related to our company values? And then you go down to, okay, what are the basic assumptions that support our values? Or what are the basic assumptions that make our Scrum dysfunctional or functional? So starting from something that's more visible and tangible, getting down to this, you would be surprised how much you actually get down to and find ways to express. So try it out. The next example is storytelling. Now, there has been a lot of literature lately around storytelling, and a lot on how you can use storytelling to change your culture, to move it forwards, right? Either by telling successful stories or by creating these successful stories in your environments. The one I want to focus on here, again, going to how do we visualize the culture for ourselves and for others, is tell a story and see what the story tells. So when I work with teams or individuals, I very often get to listen to stories, right? They tell you, okay, this happened, and then this happened, and okay, we go through how the sprint went or something like that. And apart from listening to the facts and the information that this person gives me, I also try to listen through. Is the focus on the present, the past, or the future? Is the focus on me? Is the focus on the team? Is the focus on the company? And this gives you these invisible cues of what the mindset is, what the focus is, what the underlying assumption is about these elements. And you can extend this to much more elements. You just take a look of where are we? Where are we actually? What state are we in? Right? So, and especially if you do this on a separate level or on a group level, and you combine this information from both levels. So, for example, if you imagine that you have a friend who is interested in working in your company, okay? And rather than thinking of what are the adjectives, what are the values and attributes I can use to describe my company, what if I tell him a story of something that's happening? So imagine that you tell a story about your company. And then through that story, see what's happening in that story. You know? Because when we talk about values, we tend to say what we want to say. If we're in a bad mood, we might end up going in the opposite direction. If we're in a good mood, say, yeah, it's an awesome company, right? But if you tell a story, you seem to disengage from this evaluation and judgment. You just focus on what happened in the story. So that's when you actually see the reality of what's going on, of how we do things around here. Maybe not from the first story, maybe you need a few of these, but eventually you will see a pattern emerging. A lot of suggestions out there are about how we can measure and evaluate our culture. So we find different measurements. There's a lot of research saying that if you have a strong culture, you will have a much higher success level, business, return of investment. What I do think about that, both from personal experience and like a general belief, is that you should be very careful what you're measuring. Quote from Einstein, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So my personal opinion is that we should be careful when we try to measure things, because depending on which attributes you choose, things might go wrong. And in addition, if you stick to measurements and they become public, we sometimes have the habit of fitting the numbers rather than focusing on what we really care about, right? I see a lot of heads nodding. So I'm going to just go quickly through some other examples. You can use Lego. I haven't explicitly done that with the focus of culture yet, but it's an interesting option. You can use metaphors. For example, this bridge here being a metaphor of, you describe your environment, your beliefs about your company with metaphors. So for example, you say, oh, getting to talk to this other department feels like this long bridge until I get there, right? And then people understand what you mean. People get the feeling, oh my God, that's difficult. Or, you know what? When I go to this other department, I go to QA, it's all these green trees around me, and it's so much fun, right? And it's so nice, and I'm so inspired when I go to them. And you understand what I mean. You understand that it's comfortable communication. It's nice for me, okay? You can also use sense-making models like Kinefin, like trying to separate your problems or assumptions into different groups and see which ones you can address. One thing I'm looking forward to trying soon is this funny image here is supposed to represent a success report. So something like Jürgen Apollo was also talking about that, like focusing on the good things. So we talk a lot about root cause analysis of trying to find why something went wrong, but what if we do an analysis of why something went well? Now, there is a bit of a risk there of actually considering things which are just natural to be the reasons for success, but maybe we can try to see what is it in our culture of how we do things around here which made this particular thing a success, okay? And then we can add more. So the point of all these tools, or suggestions for things you can try, is how do we find a way to make our culture visible? How do we find a way to pull this upwards, okay? To pull it from the deepest part of the iceberg as much as possible into documents and visible artifacts outside, into visible behavior. So Sylvian here shared with me yesterday a story in which he was working in a company where he was working as a CIO, and they encouraged people in teams, apart from the description of the common rules and the common values, to also in their team describe in a document what their team values are, what things they aspire to as a group, in a much more cozy, private, and personal, intimate description of that. And this is one way in which you can try to pull things out. A lot of times we talk about writing agreements in teams, but it's not only agreements of how we do things, but also how we, a bit on the deeper level, of what are the things we take for granted that we do around here. Another example, in 2009, the CEO of Netflix, he wrote a culture deck. And it's this SlideShare PowerPoint presentation of around 130 slides in which they describe the culture. According to Sheryl Sandberg, the CEO of Facebook, this may well have been the most influential document ever to come from Silicon Valley. And if you go actually to SlideShare, culture deck, culture code hashtag, you can see that ever since then, there's been a lot of companies, more gradually now, and the last time I checked, it was just a few days ago that something was uploaded. You can see a lot of companies which decide to expose their culture by making a culture deck like that. With the same hashtag, you can also find a lot of SlideShare presentations from conferences on the topic of culture, on the topic of culture change. But it is really, it's been a movement, a culture code movement, in which companies want to share more and more. Most of you are probably familiar with Zappos and the delivering happiness, and the attempt of how they want to share their culture and how they build things around fun and happiness for delivering a good customer service. And then how they would offer to actually invite you to their place, show you around, or come to you and tell you a story. Okay, so there's plenty of ways, And this, I think, is a good start. If you try to write this down, especially if you go into as many details as you can, not just the values, not just the 4 words on our website, okay, that say we got integrity. Well, everyone's got integrity. But describing of how we do things, what is it that we value in behavior, in people's natural acceptance of how we do things around here. So, to wrap up, that was quite fast, eh? We talked about the power of culture. Culture is very powerful. It can eat your strategy for breakfast. And if you fail to recognize it, it might end up controlling you or managing you. So that's why it is best to work with your culture, especially if you want to change it. And in order to do that, find a way to make it visible. The more visible it is, the more people will have common understanding of it. More people will be capable of improving it, working with it, making it better. Thank you. Do you have any questions? You'll get a mic, I think.
Okay, I'm famous now. Okay, hi everyone. Okay, my name is Daniel. You told something about show how we do things. You think it's better to observe the processes or to meet the assumptions and make them more visible? To make visible the assumptions. What is better for you? What do you think is better?
Well, we might get into the whole definitions thing, but according to Shine, processes are actually visible behavior. Processes are really the artifacts. Processes are the first things you can see. They're described in documents. You observe how people communicate and work. So the process is something that's already out there. So the message here is, let's try to expose the assumptions. Expose in a positive way. It has a bit of a negative connotation, but let's try to get them out.
Okay, so we go for the assumptions. Which technique you apply to make assumptions visible?
For example, the workshop I suggested. It is very difficult because it is something that's invisible. So if I just ask you, what are the underlying assumptions in your company, it's going to be very difficult to get to them because, okay, it's got to be something that's invisible. What do? I don't know. Sometimes it is. Sometimes you can maybe also use the comparison of basic things of how we do here compared to some. Go to other companies. Go and check them out. Learn more. Talk to your friends about their companies. Talk through stories. And if you see those slight differences, you can see where your core assumptions are. But it's not an easy thing, okay? It's something that also takes time because it also depends on whether your culture has a high trust, high openness, high transparency level, or is it more of a tight place in which everybody controls, hides things, or doesn't dare share them upwards, right? So, depending on these things, you have different level of freedom.
Thank you. And the last one is how you see a relation between these assumptions, visibility, and a coaching process. You use coaching in your workshops?
I guess the right answer here will be the consultant typical answer, which is it depends. So it really depends, pretty much on what I said about the culture. So if things are very open, you don't actually need to coach that much. You can just facilitate and they will just pop out. But if things are very tight, you might need to use some more work, some more slow step-by-step revelation process so that you can get deeper. Okay.
Morning. Thank you for your talk. There is something I missed in the presentation, which is what about the culture of our customers? What about the culture of the people that we serve? So can you explain a little bit how important it is for our organization, and maybe some tips to identify how our organizational culture is aligned or misaligned with our customers' culture? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. It's been, since it's a short talk, it's been a very difficult task not to talk about certain things. And this is one of them. For me, customer service is an extremely important thing of almost every day, every business that I can think of nowadays. And how can you identify it? What I would say is something else. How can you, if the focus here is how can you visualize it, right? What you can do, for example, is look at all services around you, places in which you are the customer. How do you perceive it? And then when you think of how am I going to show it, I'm going to give you an example. So I fly a lot, okay? And I currently fly around Europe primarily with 2 companies. And one of them has the flight attendants, they do not have name tags. So they're all anonymous people to me. They're all beautiful people, but they're all anonymous. And whenever there is a situation, I get the feeling they always go back to, and the process says, and the rule is. In this case, you are supposed to. This is the impression. Now, I'm talking about observing behavior, right? And then there's this other company, which everyone has a name tag, and for most of the cases I have observed, they use common sense. They're kind of like, okay, this is the situation. They got authority. It's like what Bjarte was talking about, having a traffic light versus a roundabout, right? So what I'm getting to is by perceiving how we consume services, how we respond to them, we can then express how we want our customers to perceive our service. So this could be a nice technique. If you try to decipher how you communicate with your telephone company and what do you think, very often, especially companies which are extremely focused on customer delivery or on customer service, very often the way they communicate with you is an example or a mirror for the culture inside the company. Not always. There are cases in which you have some rogue representatives, but in most cases, they show you what the culture is. Is it about authority? Is it about freedom? Is it about control, right? So for example, I ordered business cards from moo.com, and when there was some issue with the delivery, which was completely because of the delivery company, of the transport company, when I talked to Moo, they said, oh, we're so sorry. You know what? I'm going to give you back your money for the transport. So this guy had the complete freedom, authority, and comfort to make this decision on his own, which to me was like, whoa, maybe that is how they do things in that company. Thank you. But it is a very important part. When we talk about culture, how do we perceive our customers? So thank you for that.
Hi. So I really love this last question. And on this line, how much should we invest, or better said, maybe sacrifice, in terms of getting new clients that don't really match our culture?
Well, the question is, if they don't really match your culture, would you work with them?
That's the question.
I guess.
I mean, what's the balance? Sometimes you may need some new clients because you just...
This is pretty much where you make your decisions as a company, right? So I'm afraid I can't remember the name of that company, but I recently watched an interview exactly on that topic, and it was a C-level representative. He said, you know what? Our customer said, you got to do this, you got to do this. So their biggest customers started controlling how they're going to deliver things. And they said, you know what, we decided to be true to our culture. We said, no, thank you. Even if we struggle for a while, we'll find the right people to work with. So it's not a yes or no answer. It's a decision. You got to weigh the outcomes and weigh the decision. Do you want to keep your culture safe? Is this what you strive for? Or are you purely focused on, is your culture focused on customer satisfaction? Is this worth more than the culture in your company?
Hello.
Hi.
Just one question about top-down processes or things coming from the ground. In my company, we've been trying to have a culture change process from top level. Consultants, months of workshops and seminars, mainly involving managers. In the end, a lot of reports, a lot of new documents, new processes, things, but the actual culture in the actual working people has not changed. So my question is, once you have this culture visible, I guess mainly from the bottom, how to make the real people in the company involved in the change?
Thank you for the question. So I'm afraid that I'm not able to comment on, okay, you had consultants or certain kind of workshops and it didn't work, and why didn't it work, right? Or what the reason for that is, because that's usually a very complex situation. So I wouldn't know what happened or what didn't. As for the visualizing from the bottom up, it doesn't necessarily need to be from the bottom up. In fact, Shine is focusing a lot on how it's much more leaders' responsibility and how you got leadership and culture being two sides of the same coin. And that's why it is very often up to leaders who first start and build the original basis of the culture, and then when they notice something is dysfunctional, it's kind of up to them to try to change things. Adding to this message is we're all a part of it, so we can all do it on different levels. So exactly top down or bottom up, there's no right or wrong way to do it. Okay, what you want is, what is the culture that you want? But one of the things that happened is, it's pretty much the same as the example of TDD. If you try to force a change without understanding the culture, without working with the culture to make the next step for the change, you're very much prone to fail. So maybe if this is what happened, you know, you can fight, you can control only so much. But if the basic things that happen, if the basic assumptions in a company don't necessarily work well with the suggestion for a change, you can do all the workshops in the world and all the trainings and everything. So, you're welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
There is a problem that it's common in my experience when I try to make the culture visible. And it's about negation. So the culture becomes to be visible, but people don't want to see it. For instance, I would like to be like an Agile style leader, but things around me say that I'm a command and control style one. And so, do you have any suggestion about how to deal with the negation when somebody is not accepting what the process of making culture visible is showing him?
What did you mean by that you are command and control, or perceived to be command and control?
Oh, it's just an example. So, for example, the culture is showing that you are acting like a command and control leader.
But what do you mean by culture is showing? Like how? Who says that? Who decides
for example, you do a process like the one you are suggesting, and the process of discovering what the culture is about using exercise or everything else is a showing that people is fear about the leader, for example, and the leader thing that is not ruling by fear, but is ruling by empathy or so. So there is a gap between the perception and the reality. So how do you deal when somebody is not accepting what is coming out from this process of discovering? Sure.
I feel two topics here. So one is, well, if this is what the exercise shows, well, maybe that's the reality rather than the other reality would want to be shown, right? And then there's the other thing that every time we try to expose these things or we try to change culture, or better yet, the example of trying to do something new in our company and maybe not working with culture, but rather against it, is the moment you try to disturb the basic assumptions, you try to touch them or go against them, we have a natural defense mechanism. Now, this is a whole big topic of biases and psychology, and I couldn't claim to be an expert in the field, but very often you get agitation, fear, you get responses that are, oh, no, please don't touch that. It's like, you know, or I don't know what's wrong, but there is something wrong, and I just don't want to talk more about it. And very many times, it's only a defense mechanism because it's different from what we used to, and that gets to us, right? So maybe that is rather the situation you're describing. I'm afraid it was a bit too vague to consider exactly what's happening there, but a lot of times, especially when you go towards like fear or agitation or unconceivable aggression, then there's something behind it. That usually is, I'll stop touching there, right? So, as for maybe if the exercise showed something about command and control, maybe that's the thing you should dig deeper in and see. Maybe that is the reality. So.
Talking about visualizing the company's culture, what if it is very fragmented? I mean, it's really divided. This team has these values, the manager's team has are nice people, this other team is terrible, and different values. I mean, from where would you start working on?
It's a,
from the general, the things that are shared, from the very specifics of each team, individuals.
I'm afraid I don't remember the names of the authors, but there's actually a lot of research in exactly what they call fragmented cultures. Even Shine, he talks about microcultures, about macroculture. But there's this common expression, which is analyze that. I'm going to say visualize that. That is, if your culture is fragmented, well, the first step is still to show that. So, again, if you want to go to the deepest level, if it's fragmented, generalizing is always a bit of a risky situation. I would like to know more before I actually choose what to do. But I would probably try to look at these microcultures or islands of culture and then see the overlapping commonalities between these or how we could connect them. But again, generalizing is a bit of a dodgy choice. So maybe you can try to look at it. Maybe you can try to investigate more into fragmented cultures. And I would say go for local first. Go the deepest you can first in order to see what's going on. Okay, one more question. Apparently we're running out of time.
There is no time, sorry, for
okay.
More questions. Sorry.
Okay, no more time for questions, but thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
Ivana. Thank you.
Thank you.